So, Dr. Batiste, you were a vegetarian since you were a little boy, but what was I think you got sick on a piece of meat and decided not to eat meat anymore. But what
I
was your
did.
journey to veganism? I mentioned it a little bit in the intro, but I think we'd like
Yeah.
to hear all about your personal journey and what made you such a passionate advocate for plant-based eating.
Even as a young boy, my parents, or before I was born, my parents actually owned a health food store, believe it or not. And they had to close it down because I was the pleasant surprise, as you said, as they like to call it. And so they had to close the health food store down. But my mom used to make gluten and teach how to prepare meats, prepare vegan and plant-based foods before they had the labels with it at all. But they did eat meat. And so one of the things I observed growing up was my dad was a diabetic. And part of our family were insulin needles, was insulin, the syringes, things of these nature that were all there. That was part and parcel of what I observed as a child growing up. And I do remember actually bring up a funny story about having a piece of meat. I was very particular about what I would eat. And so I had a piece that made me sick and I was just done. I wouldn't touch any more meat at all at that point in time. But I was unfortunately a junk fooditarian, as I like to call it. I love junk food, as many, I'm sure your audience members can relate to that.
And I
But,
can too.
yes, yes, I always say my name is Columbus and I'm a recovering sugarholic, you know, but I'll tell you, at a certain point, I had finished med school. I was now chief of cardiology. I was practicing as an interventional cardiologist. I was still boarded in internal medicine as well. So 3 board certifications. And, I watched my dad, I moved him out closer to me, and I watched my dad suffer a demise. And I remember my dad was a proud man. And so he had diabetes that ravaged his body. And so he could no longer keep his foot elevated without it dropping. We call it foot drop and neuropathy. That's the impact of the nerves. And so he loved to get dressed up in fancy shoes, but he had to wear braces. So as a dutiful son who was now accomplished, I said, well, I'm going to take you out and buy these expensive shoes that will fit and accommodate your braces. And he was like a kid in a candy store. He loved the shoes and would get dressed up and he would go to church or different events and meetings. And little did we know is that as a result of wearing the brace in those shoes, it caused a small tear in his skin, in his foot, that then led to an ulcer, an infection, and an ulcer. And that began that vicious cycle towards the end of my dad's life. That was really hard for me to embrace because of the fact that in my mind, it's like I triggered it. I started it as I watched my dad go downhill in spiral before his death. And so coming out when he passed away, and what's so crazy about that time in my life when my dad passed away is that I was actually planning on flying out to my brother-in-law's wedding. And I stopped by my parents' house as I typically would do to just say, hey, how you doing? And say goodbye. And I saw him. Now, as a physician, granted, I've never been that type of doctor who looks at someone and tells a patient, you have X amount of time to live, or that tell the family member they're about to die. Because my feeling is that I don't have that sort of power and control, but I could tell you in terms of where they're at in disease state. But when I looked at my dad in that moment, I broke out in tears because I realized he didn't have long for this world and I knew I couldn't leave. I felt I couldn't even leave to fly out. And what's so crazy about that time is that all of my siblings all had this sensation that they needed to come by the house in the middle of the week. And we were all there on the day that my dad passed away. And I remember just that the darkness and the feeling of despair of, doesn't matter how old you are, when you lose someone that you love, and especially a parent, you feel like an orphan. You feel like if you're lost. And I had that feeling, even though I was a father and I had my own kids and my wife and so forth. And out of there, I felt guilty. I felt horribly guilty for what I felt I did to my dad and for what I felt I didn't. And as I started to really read and research, and I had started to stumble back into this area before because I would have patients ask me, hey, doc, what should I eat? After we worked on the heart and areas, everything. And I'd say little quips. Oh, just do 4 out of 7. Do well 4 out of 7 days. No one's perfect. Just do this. I'd say little things. None of it evidence-based. None of it research. None of it science. And so I started to kind of begin the process of reading. But after my dad, I really picked up the pace in terms of reading. And I'll never forget it. It was Caldwell Esselstyn's book, Prevent Reverse Heart Disease. And although my dad died as an ill effect of diabetes, there was the chapter Moderation Kills. just struck home to me. It struck a chord. And all of a sudden, there was just this aha moment that anyone on the outside looking at my dad would say he's pretty healthy, that he doesn't smoke, he doesn't drink. Yeah, he has a little bit of meat every blue moon. My mom made pretty wholesome meals. He loved fast food, but didn't overly have it. Loved sweets, loved processed chips and sodas and things of that nature. But when you look at the ill effects it had on his body, all of a sudden it resonated with me as a cardiologist because I give medications to patients on a regular basis. And some patients, they can't tolerate a small amount. Other patients can tolerate a whole lot before they have issues. And so you never know the amount of these deleterious foods or food-like substances that you put in your body, that how it will impact you negatively. And as I realized this out of my dad's life, I realized that I can't just hide this information anymore, that I owe it to him. I felt it was sort of my penance. Sort of my what I owed not only my dad for what I wasn't able to contribute to him. And I started out by saying he owned a health store, so he was knowledgeable. But sometimes we need encouragement from those around us. Sometimes we need someone to kind of bump us back on that straight and narrow to say, you know what, this is the course you need to go on a consistent basis. And you don't really have that latitude to stray from it. And so that was my journey towards plant-based. And as I realized the power of it, I realized too as well what could have happened. I realized I needed to change my own life and my own practices of how I had learned how to eat inside med school and in training, in the ways in which I was taking care of myself, which was not healthy. And I'll end on this, right? So sorry, not to ramble, but during that time, I had gotten used to a lot of paying bills online and so forth. But during that period with my dad, I kind of went into this place, and so I let my life insurance go. Not intentionally, but I just forgot about it. And so they had to come out and draw my blood work, and my financial planner was like, hey, Columbus, we're gonna get your blood work done and everything else. I was like, oh no, I've been doing really well, but let me do a little bit better. Let me let me start training like Dotsie and everything like that. Let me hit it. And she said, no, just check in. So they got my information, and she said, I've never seen this before, Columbus. How does anyone go from preferred to super preferred when you're older 5 years? And it didn't strike a chord still at that moment until years later as I reflected back on it. And the only difference was the way in which I approached life, my eating patterns of eating whole food plant-based, of really transitioning away, not using labels, but eating food that was alive, that could feed my body and taking care of myself. And so there's power that's there. And so that's what led to my journey down this road and pathway for my patients and being known as that guy, that cardiologist.